Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Future of Donor Funding webinar. We have a number of attendees still joining the call, and we'll start in a few minutes. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending the BDO webinar on the future of donor funding, building sustainable nonprofit organizations. My name is Caroline Groenewald. I'm a partner at BDO South Africa, working from our Cape Town office. I specialize in nonprofit organizations, and I'm the partner lead for donor-funded engagements in South Africa. I'm supported this morning by our marketing team, Makapa Makgoro and Akani Maluleke. Just a few housekeeping matters before we start. This webinar will be recorded and made available on the BDO website afterwards. So if you can't attend the full session or want to share it with someone else, it will be published there. And you would have noted that your mics are muted and cameras off. This will remain for the entire webinar. There is a Q&A functionality, so please pose any questions in the Q&A. And towards the end of the webinar, we'll try to answer as many questions as possible. Nearly a year ago, the international aid world was shaken by the USAID funding freezes, which created immense uncertainty for a number of our largest organizations in South Africa. USAID funding in South Africa had a strong pull towards HIV and AIDS, but many other organizations working in health system strengthening, early education, and various other benefit sectors were impacted deeply and had to scale operations or close doors completely. I believe it's appropriate and important to stand together as a nonprofit community and allies of the community to recognize the importance of the work that is done in our country by associations not for gain, and have a forward-looking approach to how sustainability can be built and how organizations can be scaled. I'm very fortunate to have two distinguished professionals that will join me as panelists today. First up, Clovis Wamambo is a seasoned finance leader and a qualified chartered accountant with over 15 years of experience spanning financial services, construction, and the nonprofit sector. He joined Mothers to Mothers in 2019 and currently serves as Senior Director of Finance and Operations, where he leads the strategic finance and operational function for M2M South Africa and supports the organization's mission through strong financial stewardship and strategic insight. Before joining M2M, Mr. Wamambo held senior finance roles at Common Good, NACCW, Tetrad Holdings, and FBC Holdings, building deep expertise in financial reporting, governance, and regulatory compliance across complex operating environments. His career has been shaped by a passion for ensuring that funding models are sustainable, accountable, and fit for purpose, particularly in mission-driven organizations. It is always a pleasure to have an in-depth conversation with Mr. Wamambo, and I know he brings a forward-looking perspective to the future of donor funding. Thank you for joining me today, Mr. Wamambo.
Thank you, Caroline. That's very kind of you.
Our next panelist is Professor Linda Gail Becker. She's the Chief Executive Officer of the Desmond Tutu Health Foundation and Director of the Desmond Tutu HIV Center at the Institute of Infectious Disease and Molecular Medicine at UCT. Professor Becker is a physician, scientist, and infectious disease specialist. Her research interests include programmatic and action research around antiretroviral rollout and TB integration, prevention of HIV in women, youth, and MSM. Professor Becker serves on numerous international scientific and advisory committees. She's an A+ rated scientist and has published more than 700 peer-reviewed papers. So thank you for your time this morning and for joining us, Professor Becker.
Thanks, Caroline. Always a pleasure.
Thank you. So today we'll explore how donor funding is evolving, the opportunities it presents, and how nonprofits can thrive sustainably in the years ahead. Our goal is to foster a forward-looking, positive discussion and maybe offer some practical insight for all of our participants. So I want to open with a question to both our panelists and maybe first to you, Professor Becker. How do you view the current landscape of donor funding for nonprofit organizations in South Africa and, if you will, globally?
Thanks, Caroline. You mentioned that, it's absolutely seared into my brain the 20th of January last year. We've sort of felt the aftermath towards middle of February of those executive orders. And I think it's safe to say that certainly my world, the NGO world within the sort of HIV, TB landscape really was shaken to the core. There's no doubt that US federal funding, donor funding, was a huge contribution, not only to HIV and TB in this country and the region, but really, as you've mentioned, to many important programs and life-saving interventions around the world, really. So we've had, 20 odd months since then where we've been thinking about what's happened. And as I've mentioned, the sort of specifically 12 months since then around, what can be done in this setting. And there's no doubt we've heard it loudly said on the radio, on the television, other places that we do need to diversify. We need to not be so dependent on a single funder. And so I think the most important activity that we've all been playing in the last 12 months has been really to try and understand a broader, more diversified funding landscape. And not only looking outwards beyond our borders, particularly to the global north, but also internally and saying what is available right here in South Africa. So I would say there has been a huge reliance on US funding in the past. But as we heard, I think very clearly articulated at Davos as well a couple of weeks ago, this is a new world order, and I think we have to move on. So I think in the NGO world, we are coming to that recognition that we really do have to not let nostalgia be a strategy, but actually move forward with a great deal of sort of positive thinking about discovering new funders and new donors and new opportunities.
Thank you, Professor Becker. So adapt and change course a little bit. Yeah. Same question to you, Mr. Wamambo.
Thanks, Caroline, and thanks, Professor, for those insights. And again, I think if I can start, Caroline, we are genuinely, at a genuine inflection point in donor funding. And I say this deliberately, not dramatically. I think we are operating in a fundamentally different donor funding landscape than even 5 years ago. So globally, funding is becoming more constrained, more competitive, and far more politically influenced. I mean, according to the OECD, the official development assistance declined in 2024 and is projected to fall again in 2025 by about 9 to 17%. This is not a temporary dip, it's a structural reset. Coming back home for nonprofits in South Africa, this is playing out in a very tangible way. We are seeing fewer long-term predictable grants and more short-term, highly restricted funding. At the same time, expectations around governance, compliance, and reporting continue to rise, which again is absolutely appropriate, but it comes at a cost. Organizations are being asked to deliver more impact faster with fewer resources and less flexibility. And you did mention about USAID per se. The restructuring and effective dismantling of large parts of the USAID program has actually accelerated this trend. USAID historically has been the largest and most stable funder globally, and its contraction has sent shockwaves through health, education, and humanitarian systems. But there's a hopeful part. This moment is also forcing a necessary evolution. It's pushing organizations to rethink sustainability, to develop income, to invest in financial leadership, and to articulate impact more clearly than ever before. The reality is this. The old funding model, where organizations relied heavily on a small number of bilateral donors, is no longer viable. The future will favor NGOs that are not only mission-driven, but strategically led, organizations that can demonstrate value, manage risk, and of course, adapt quickly to a changed environment. That's how I see the donor landscape at the moment, Caroline.
That's perfect. Thank you for that insight, Mr. Wamambo. And, as much as we want to be forward-looking, you can't do that without understanding the history and knowing we are at a pivotal point and things will never be the way it was in the past. Exciting, but maybe something that we really need to adjust to as an industry. So, Professor Becker, are there, and if there are, what positive trends or innovations are you seeing in the donor engagement and funding streams?
Yeah, thanks, Colleen. And just to say, Cleophas, I think you've summed it up brilliantly. A lot of the attention has been on the US change in, sort of pivot in the last little while. But of course, as Cleophas has mentioned, there has been indicators for some time now of other funders, particularly Europe, even the Scandinavian countries, which we've really relied on heavily, have also been backtracking. And of course, this is because of other priorities moving into countries' view. There's a lot more spending on defense, of course, and also a really inward-looking nationalist agenda, which eschews the international donor industry as a need, I guess. So, I think what has happened happily at the same time as we've seen a rise of philanthropy, and that is very exciting. I do want to say maybe not to the same extent internally, and this is somewhere where I think we have to continue to really work, advocate for, real advocates for more philanthropy, not only in South Africa, but also in the region. But when we look beyond that to the traditional major philanthropists, the big foundations. We do see them stepping into the breach to an extent, although obviously very anxious on their side that a huge amount of reliance is coming. For example, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, now known as the Gates Foundation, took a recent strategy that they would not pick up the gap that has been left by USAID, but would continue to stick to their mission. But it has been good to see that they've stepped in, certainly in research gaps. Again, a lot of the attention has been on programmatic aid, but those of us in South Africa are also reeling a little bit on the research funding side. I don't know, listeners may be less aware that we also have an executive order that has cut off the National Institutes of Health as a research funder for South Africa. And this is, so it's impacting not only our programmatic income in terms of funding, but also our research funding. So this is where we have seen Gates, for instance, stepping up. There have been other wonderful funders that have really stepped into the fore recently. And perhaps from my point of view, the most exciting has been seeing a real emphasis on women's health. And there have been some major new initiatives to try and address the inequality of the past. We haven't seen as much health progress and innovation in women's health. And so we're seeing these philanthropists, funding agencies, foundations stepping forward to actually fill some gaps. So here I would just say that NGOs need to be on the internet. There are some wonderful websites where you can go and see what's happening in the landscape, and be responsive to some of these initiatives that are being made more available. But I think Clearface has mentioned that we are going to have to be sharper, smarter, more efficient, and tell our stories far more impactfully in order to attract that funding, because it's a little bit like the Hunger Games. As that funding has reduced, of course, the pie has, if anything, shrunk, and yet there's still as many players in the game. So it does mean you have to be smarter, fitter than the next person. So it really does make us look at our strategies and our competitiveness.
Thank you for that, Professor Becker. You mentioned NIH now, and I want to go to that question because the media focus was very much on USAID, and suddenly the name was on everybody's lips. People who never knew that this was a agency or a mechanism that funded organizations in South Africa. But through the US government, there was still NIH, there's still CDC. You mentioned the executive order on NIH funding, and do you think CDC, other NIH funding is at risk from the US government as well? And are there any new models of partnership that you could recommend?
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing that's happening in this ruptured world that we're living in is an amazing pushback on science. So walking sort of hand in glove with this has been a real threat to scientific innovation, progress, etc. And again, what listeners may not be aware of is both USAID and CDC both have a strong research agenda. So there is an element of funding. And here I want to really sort of blow South Africa's trumpet. We make a considerable contribution to world understanding, particularly around communicable diseases. So it's partly the tragedy that we do have the biggest HIV epidemic in the world. We have one of the biggest TB epidemics in the world. We obviously deal with a bunch of other non-communicable diseases, but communicable diseases have been where we have really led the way in, and then organizations like Mothers to Mothers have really grown out of that tragedy, but now doing such wonderful work in women's health and maternal child health. But starting from how do we solve the challenge of this public health problem? And as I say, we've made startling contributions in the past. So I would say that some of this pushback has not only been because of the executive order that no financial aid will go to foreign countries, in particular South Africa, but somehow research funding has got caught up in that. And we also have pushback on research writ large, science writ large. So it really is an assault coming from a number of different avenues. To answer your question, though, I think we are waiting with bated breath to see, first of all, whether that relationship with South Africa in particular is going to change, mend, get better. And what the ongoing relationship will be vis-a-vis not only foreign aid and programmatic assistance, but also on the research front. At this stage, I'm afraid all I can tell you is the water looks very murky, and we don't have any clear answers for now. So coming back to what I think Cleophas and I are both saying is this cannot be a time where we sit and move into a fetal position in anxiety. I think we have to say, what can we be doing that is different, that is innovative, that moves us out of this dependence on US funding?
Thank you, Professor Becker. And I just like what you said, tell your story. Let the world know the work that we do. And that's also how you gain traction. So we've touched on this slightly, but to Mr. Wamambo, given the current strain in the South Africa and US relationship, do you see increase in funding in the short term by US organizations? I mean, we've mentioned the Gates Foundation. These organizations can't fill the gap left by USAID, but it can maybe change the course of how funding is structured and maybe fill a short bit or a small bit of that gap.
Thanks, Caroline. I think what we get to know or what we see is that large US foundations will continue to play an essential role in global development. I think the Gates Foundation alone, if we look at it, it disburses over $8 billion annually, primarily in global health, education, and innovation. That commitment matters enormously. But we also need to be honest about scale. The reduction in government aid globally runs into tens of billions of dollars every year. So no private foundation, regardless of size or intent, can actually fully replace that. Where philanthropy excels is not in replacing government, but it is enabling progress, and foundations are uniquely positioned to fund innovation. They can also pilot new models. They can also help absorb risk and test approaches that government may then take to scale at a later stage. In that sense, philanthropy is a catalytic rather than a compensatory. It's not going to compensate for the loss of the funding that we have. It's just going to support the movement as it moves forward. So the opportunity and responsibility for NGOs is to position themselves accordingly, to approach foundations not simply as funders, but as partners in learning, innovation, and system changes. The future actually lies in smarter alignment. Philanthropy foundation innovation, funding innovation, government funding scale, and NGO delivering impact on the ground with credibility and accountability. That ecosystem approach is where real sustainable progress happens, and NGOs that understand these dynamics and position themselves as strong, credible partners will be the best placed to attract funding in this extremely challenging environment.
Thank you for that. To know that the real incubation the innovation lies with the foundation and not the government. I think that's a very powerful point. If it scales, it already needs to be tested, but that's not going to happen at a G2G type level. That's going to happen at an organization with the skills and expertise and the drive.
Yeah, so Colleen, I would just add there. I mean, I think Clearface mentioned this. Government is inherently very conservative, right? They are risk averse, and correctly so, right? They have limited amounts of money that they need to make sure that when they spend it, it is going to get the impact that hopefully it is intended to do. And I think this is a role this is the niche role that NGOs can play, is really to do that innovation, to do that health service research. How do I take this new innovation and panel beat it so that it fits into our health system or our teachings, education system, or our climate environment, whatever the case may be. And then, then to bring government along as well here. And this is often our hardest thing, is the getting research or getting innovation into practice, getting it to be adopted and scaled up. And this is where not only do we need to have our donors as partners, but we need to have government as a partner as well. So that at that point, and I think this has probably been one of the biggest lessons of the whole PEPFAR USAID sort of tragedy, has been many of us as NGOs have been doing some of the work that government needed and should be doing. And in some ways now that needs to be handed back to government to say, right, that's your job. You need to be doing this. We'll come alongside you. We'll be your partner. This is our job. And then it becomes much clearer about what needs to be an NGO's sort of role, and where government steps up and has to do what they need to do. And hopefully in that setting, more philanthropy will actually begin to play a role here in South Africa as well, where people will say, I understand I'm doing this that is separate to where my tax dollars are currently going and need to be, working within government structures. So I think at the same time that it has been a rupture and we have been sort of torn apart, I think it's an incredibly important time to say, can we do business differently going forward? Is this a new structure for how NGOs and government work in our country for the good of South Africans at large?
I think that is quite powerful, because we as NGOs, your heart is into stepping into a crisis. You want to fix something, but having accountability from a government and from a NGO sector, and we have a very strong NGO sector in South Africa, maybe because the government is failing on some of the issues that should be addressed, specifically in the, what did you call it, the PEPFAR tragedy that just took place. And then, Professor Becker, I mean, you're CEO of a very successful NGO with large impact. What are some of the approaches that your organization have implemented to achieve sustainability beyond the traditional donor support, which, as we've said now, we're almost trying to get away from, because we saw the impact it has if a government decides not to continue?
Yeah, so this is literally the million rand question, Colleen, and I'd love to hear Clearface's sort of take on this as well. The NGO that he represents is multi-country, whereas we are really restricted here within the South African setting. There's no doubt this is a two-edged sword. I just want to say the first thing that can often happen is when funding is restricted and people are running towards a potential funding source, it can distort a strategy, a mission, a purpose, and that can sometimes be very negative. So what we've tried to do is, first of all, articulate very clearly what is our mission and purpose, so we understand our ecosystem and where we work within that. At the same time, though, it is important to be creative within that and to say, what is, read the room. What is out there? What is happening? And how do we innovate even within this scenario? So, for instance, we first of all, let me also say we are a research organization, so we innovate, so we like to be on the crest of the wave, so we like to be almost anticipating where the next sort of frontier is in terms of innovation. The problem with that is you can sometimes be ahead of the funding agencies, right? Because it isn't yet what I call, mainstream, and the problem with that is then everybody's jumping on that bandwagon. So you've got to find the sweet spot where you tell your story, you tell your impact in such a way that you're kind of moving into an area where you can attract funding, and people come towards you, but it is it isn't yet sort of everybody's cup of tea. So it is around being very creative, innovative, nimble, and being able to pivot quickly. Those have been our main strategic sort of ways forward. And then at the same time, safeguarding those partnerships or those collaborations, or those trusted relationships that Clearfast was mentioning that we've already established, making sure that we nurture those, but we bring those partners along to a new area of innovation. So not only find new partners, but also nurture and ensure that we safeguard and look after the old partnerships, whilst, as I say, staying within the mission. Because I think this is important, that you are very clear what your role is, what your niche is, and what your value add is. What is your value that you can bring to the donor community, remembering this is a two-way street. And this is sometimes something we forget, those of us who are fundraisers, that donors are seeking to also put money into a trusted solution, and so it is to understand that and then to approach it with that mindset.
And it does seem like you need to educate your partners from time to time on what's on the cusp, what's coming in research, which I really like. Mr. Wamambo, maybe if you want to add, sustainability beyond traditional donor support, any input from your side?
Sure, and thanks, Prof. I think you spoke it quite well, particularly looking at how things need to be going forward given this current status. I think critically to just say is, I think from a finance perspective, one thing that we noted during this time was that survival starts with cash. I mean, during this crisis, it did not matter any budget that you heard. I think what NGO really needs is real-time cash forecasting, scenario modeling, your best, your worst case scenario, and clarity on how unrestricted and flexible funding can carry the organization. Let's be honest, multi-year awards once masked liquidity risk. Without them, weak cash governance became existential very, very fast. You could see how a lot of organizations were struggling, how things were, could not be covered in time, and of course we had to get into a different drive to restructure some of our positions. And I think diversification of funding needs to be key. That is beyond a replacement of USAID. It's not simply, find another USAID-like donor, but actively rebalance the funding mix across all channels, your bilaterals, your multilaterals, your private foundations, corporates, project funding. I think the last thing I'll touch on is being able to look at cost agility, not just cost cutting. Across the board cutting, does damage, delivery and morale. What's really needed then is cost agility, understanding which costs are truly fixed or variable, and rapid resizing overheads without breaking compliance and controls. Of course, willingness to pause, redesign, and even exit programs that are structurally loss-making. So finance, is definitely moved from budget police to a strategic cost navigator so that we support the organization as we go. These are some of the strategies I think we have also tried to implement as we navigate through during this extremely challenging time.
Colleen, I'll add
Thank
just
you.
two things
Yeah.
as a non-financial person, and here I'm, I'm a hardcore biomedical scientist. But what I would say is, don't spend money you don't have. So cash is king, as clear. So we do not spend anything if there is not a project, a budget line. And secondly, this is our lives. It waxes and wanes. So in the time of fat, get your reserves, set up your reserves and make sure your reserves are there for that time when the lean hits. Now, admittedly, last year was a lean none of us anticipated, and it was such a shock. But just, it really is good advice to say, save in the fat times for those lean moments. So reserves, very important.
Thank you. You both speak like true accountants, Professor Becker, definitely. Can moonlight as an accountant. Mr. Mabambo, I mean, we spoke about philanthropy, can't rely on donors. So if we start looking to individuals and what they want to give. So our Generation Z are entering the workforce now. A trait of the generation is their willingness and eagerness to contribute to society. Also a very tech-savvy generation, each more than the last. So, I mean, you mentioned cash is king, you need money to operate, but even in your organization, you need volunteers to donate their time, their expertise. So how can nonprofits engage tech and younger donors to leverage their enthusiasm for the social good?
Caroline, if there's a reason I remain very optimistic about the future of nonprofit sector, it's Gen Z. The Gen Z is uniquely positioned to drive social impact. They are digital natives. This is a generation defined by purpose, connectivity, and action. We know it. More than 90% of Gen Z donors engage through mobile-first platforms, and they expect transparency, immediacy, and authenticity as a baseline, not a bonus. They don't just want to donate. They want to contribute skills, ideas, and time. They want to see impact, and they want to be part of creating it. So nonprofits that embed tech first, whether it's mobile giving, micro fundraising campaigns, or digital volunteer platforms, will tap into this Gen Z enthusiasm and reshape how we fund and deliver social good. I think technology makes this all possible. Digital storytelling and micro giving, virtual volunteering, and skills-based matching platforms, real-time dashboards. These two allow NGOs to turn supporters into contributors and collaborators. But this requires a significant mindset shift. As we know, Gen Z does not respond to hierarchy or gatekeeping. They respond to openness, co-creation, and honesty, including about challenges and or failures. So the organizations that will thrive are those that stop asking the question, how do we get Gen Z to support us? And they start asking, how do we build with them? Done well, this doesn't just unlock funding, but as we know it, it builds movement. And the world is going towards just having some movement in place that the Gen Z will continue to support. I think in a nutshell, that's where I see the Gen Z coming in. And Professor, you're more than welcome to give your thoughts on this one.
So Cleophas, you summed it up beautifully. I mean, from a biological point of view, these young people, they are using the parts of their brain, as you say, that demand total authenticity, transparency, and immediate results. And so that, I think, really ups our game. This notion, the Archbishop used to say this so beautifully, used to say the best thing about young people is they see through our smoke and our mirrors, So the time really for this then is to put that aside and to recognize, who are you? What do you do? What is your impact? What can you deliver? And what does the world need today? There is no better expert in that sense than a young person who's entering as an adult into that world. And we've seen it, the activism, the advocacy that is happening in climate change, in democracy, in pushback for what we're seeing in the geopolitical world, I think is just extraordinary. And so I think tapping into that energy is really what what we can take advantage of, and I could not agree more. It's nothing about us without us, is the sort of saying we use in the HIV community, and it really is about co-engineering solutions, bringing people on board. And then the last thing I would say is, we have come from an era where it was big money and single grants. My mum, and I'm old, you can see, but my mum used to always say, look after the pennies and they'll look after the pounds. So I would say that it is that sort of notion of smaller amounts of money, even donation of time, that is going to be the new world order. And it does mean we have to be thinking about how we look at our portfolios with this sort of approach. But I think that probably is the way of the future. And those young people who give small amounts in their, sort of 20s and early 30s will, grow into philanthropists as they get older. So that culture of giving and contributing, I think, we can nurture as well in a way that is respectful and engaged, and speaks of partnerships.
I really love that. Build with them, like you said. I think that's very powerful. We are running out of time, which I almost can't believe. There's one question in the chat that I want to ask to both of you, and then I'll leave us to closing comments. But Professor Becker, you touched on this as well, but we're trying to diversify, we're trying to be sustainable as organizations, but how can you diversify your income streams while staying true to your mission as an organization?
Yeah, and I think this is about saying, first of all, I think there is the recognition that there will be some opportunities. You just have to say that doesn't fit and it isn't a good fit, and we're not going to go down there, because it's time wasting and resource wasting to chase something that you don't have the skill set for, that it doesn't fit your culture. So, and then I think if you do see the opportunity, it's about telling your story in a way that fits the donor, but does not take you outside of your mission. And that requires creativity. So here I would say, draw on your team. Your team is going to be really important here. They're going to have good ideas as well. Particularly those younger people, bring them in, hear their ideas, get some fresh ideas on how do we literally, how can we be nimble in going for a particular new funder or getting an old funder to think in a new way that still meets your mission statement. And that means really understanding who you are, what you do, and what you do best. So it does mean quite a lot of introspection around who are we and what is our mission. And many of us, particularly new young NGOs, we don't put time and work into that. So I really want to, encourage people to spend time thinking about mission, purpose, and sort of change theory, if you like. How do we bring impact around? What is our niche? What makes us compelling? And then go and tell that story to that prospective donor.
Thank you.
And Professor, I can add a little bit to that. I think there's gotta be stronger donor value proposition. And I'm adding a finance twist to this based on what you have actually articulated right now. In a tighter funding market, good programs are not enough. NGOs must clearly articulate, demonstrable outcomes and value for money, why they are a low-risk partner in volatile environments, and their ability to deliver at scale, adapt quickly, steward funds responsibility. I think in a nutshell, I would say this is where you need to have, and you spoke about your team around you, this is where you need to have your finance, your M&E, and programs speaking just one voice around what they're going to deliver around this. And I think that's what I can just add to this one.
Thank you.
One message. I like that. We're almost to the end of our webinar, so I'll just ask a closing remark from the both of you, and that is where you would like to see the non-profit landscape in 5 years' time, and if you can believe it, that would be 2031. So maybe first to you, Mr. Wamamo.
So that's a very good question, Carlin. I think a lot of people have had this thinking for a while now. I think in 5 years, I would like to see a non-profit sector that is more resilient, more confident, and should also be locally led. A sector where organizations are not constantly operating on the edge of financial vulnerability, but have diversified income, strong reserves, just like what Professor said, and the capable financial leadership. I would like to see funding that is longer term and more flexible, funding that recognizes that sustainable impact requires investments in systems, people, and leadership, not just activities. I also would like to see a deeper collaboration across sectors, that is your government, your philanthropy, business, civil society working together with shared accountability than the fragmented agendas. And finally, I would like to see non-profit shaping the future, not just reacting to it. They have to be using data, technology, and innovation to demonstrate value, influence policy, and drive meaningful change, even in a constrained funding environment. If we get this right, the sector won't just survive the next five years, but it will emerge stronger, smarter, and more impactful than ever before. That's how I want to see this sector growing in the next 5 years.
Oh, lovely. Professor Becker?
Colleen, that was Cleophas just said it absolutely beautifully. And so I just absolutely endorse everything he has said. But I would just add, and maybe, sort of enhance a little bit or amplify a little bit around, I'm in the health sector. I'm hopeful that we will, in the next 5 years, have an NPO sector that truly South Africa can be proud of, that is largely funded from within. I think that would be, and that speaks to that South African-led concept. But that also we become partners to government. So we're not filling critical holes that, and doing the sort of crisis management, but we're actually truly bringing value add, whether it's climate, whether it's in the education sector, whether it's in new employment, whatever the case may be, that our role is to add and enhance what government is already doing. And that for me, then we really have reached a pinnacle where we are true partners, bringing the best outcomes for South Africans at large and reducing suffering, but not only reducing suffering, but actually helping South Africans thrive in every single sort of aspect of their lives and their communities. That for me, I think would be, a dream come true. And it's a mission that we continue to strive towards.
And that's what makes this industry so special. It's built by dreamers. It's built by individuals that operate in hope and that hope for a better future for those that can't hope for themselves and those that come after us. So thank you. That's very inspiring closing remarks. So I want to thank everyone for making the time to join us today. I think I could have kept going with this conversation for a very long time. We didn't even get to our, our Q&As. So thank you to Professor Becker and Mr. Wamambo for your time this morning, for sharing honestly and positively where you can, and for your wisdom in working in this important industry. Thank you to my marketing team that's supporting us in the background. Yeah, thank you, everyone. This brings us to the end of the webinar. Goodbye and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.